Right. Hello, and welcome to another episode of another Bitcoin podcast. This is now episode 3, so I'm excited to be joined today by Seb Bunney. Seb is the co-founder of Looking Glass, which is an educational platform that specialises in making the topics of Bitcoin and economics accessible to everybody. He also writes the newsletter, The Chi of Self-Sovereignty, and he's co-authored the book, Behaviours for Bitcoin, and he's also more recently authored the book, The Hidden Cost of Money, I've got here. And it's that's going to be providing a lot of the talking points that we're going to discuss today. So I don't know if you've noticed, actually, I've got a pen sticking out of this book, so I've made a lot of notes. It's a book that I've underlined all sorts of quotes and things. So the very first two that I underlined actually were two things that you said. One was everything is downstream from money, and the second was deep down you know that something isn't right. So particularly owning in on everything is downstream from money. Can you just sort of explain what you mean by that and what you meant by that? Because that's sort of very early in the book.
Absolutely. So first off, I hugely appreciate you having me on. I think that I've done a few talks on this idea that like we are all Satoshi. Bitcoiners have heard about this this quote, "We are all Satoshi," or this idea about "we are all Satoshi." And I think, what does it actually mean? And the way that I kind of interpret it is that Bitcoin is like fully decentralized. There's no marketing department for Bitcoin. So in order for Bitcoin to succeed in this world, ultimately we as individuals, we have to put ourselves out there and we've got to discuss and share our views and our opinions. And so whenever there's a new podcast that's kind of like emerging, I'm always happy to help out, because I think that everyone has a unique perspective on how the world works. Everyone talks and asks questions in their own unique way. And so it's all of these talks that kind of help share the vision of Bitcoin and the ethos of Bitcoin and how different people look at money, monetary policy, Bitcoin, you name it. And so again, like I appreciate you having me on, and I'm excited to kind of chat and go deep. But to answer your question, I would say, so everything is downstream of money is something that I stumbled upon only in the last like 5 or 6 years, but in hindsight, it becomes so obvious. And so I'll share a couple stories that will kind of help illuminate why I think everything is downstream of money. So first off, my parents separated when I was quite young. I was about 4 or 5 years old. My parents separated. And what that meant is that I was raised by my mum. And because I was raised by my mum, she had to go out and work and put food on the table for my 2 brothers and I. She had to put a roof over our heads, and bringing in just a single income, that made it incredibly challenging. So she wasn't able to meet our emotional needs to the extent that she might have wanted to be able to. So because of money, because she had to support our family, support my 2 brothers and I, all of a sudden it started to impact her ability to meet our emotional needs. So that's kind of like story number 1. And this is when I looked back on this in hindsight, I realized, depending on our monetary environment, if people have capacity to show up authentically and pursue whatever it is that motivates them, they're able to achieve more or less. So money already is shaping how we're showing up as individuals. And then the second one, I would say, is my passion, my first love was mountain biking. And I started teaching mountain biking at a very young age. And so in my teenage years, when I started teaching mountain biking, I was getting paid something like, 16, 17 bucks an hour. And I very quickly realized that if I wanted to make a career of this, if I wanted to raise a family, if I wanted to buy a house, there was just like no way I was going to do that on a mountain bike wage. And so it made me question, is this a trajectory that I can actually pursue? Can I pursue my passions, or do I have to focus on making money to be able to simply survive? And so in hindsight, again, I started to recognize that our monetary environment, when we're facing inflation, when we're facing rising cost of living, shapes our ability to pursue what it is that we're interested in. And so from this, it really started to highlight just how important money is in society. And so by the time that I wrote this book, to me, it was this foundational pillar to our economy, to our ability to show up, to our environment, is that everything is downstream of money. When our money is broken, when we're facing inflation, when we're facing monetary intervention, it is altering how we as individuals are showing up. And I'll give you just one more little point, which is when we think about our environment and money, how could those two things possibly be interconnected? But when we're facing rising cost of living, rising prices, all of a sudden what that's saying is that our money is losing value. So if our money is losing value, then we're actually incentivized to consume over save, given that our purchasing power is greatest in the present moment. So what that means is when money is losing value over time, we're incentivized to consume. When we consume resources. Resources deplete our natural environment. One of the reasons why we're destroying our forests, we're destroying our waterways, we're polluting the world around us as a result of our consumption habits, because money is incentivizing consumption. It's not incentivizing saving. So all of this, to me, is just highlighting this idea that everything is downstream of money. When our money is broken, when it doesn't incentivize us to save, when it doesn't support us pursuing what it is that we're motivated to go and do, all of a sudden it leads to all these issues in society, and we can dive more and more into those things.
Just before Christmas, I caught up with a couple of my friends I hadn't seen for a couple of months, and I don't know what it's like when in your circle of friends, and how many of them are Bitcoiners or not. But in mine, I'm probably the only one really. So and this was perhaps sort of fueled by some beers as well, but we always get into this sort of debate, and we got into a little bit of sort of a verbal altercation, and I was criticised because all I ever talk about is Bitcoin, and that was the criticism that was levelled at me. And I sort of got to thinking sort of afterwards, and to be fair, it's probably quite an accurate criticism, but subsequently they wanted to talk about other things, and I agreed to do that. I said, listen, we'll just leave the talk, we'll talk about something else. And the first thing that they wanted to talk about was the war in Ukraine. And I'm thinking, everything you want to talk about is downstream of what I want to talk about, but I'm just not able to sort of articulate it and link those two things back. But as I say, almost every topic that people want to discuss is, or actually every topic that people want to discuss is in some way affected by money and our monetary system, and usually in this case negatively. So you touched on family there, and there's a point in the book where you ask the question, to think about something that you've ever sacrificed, basically because you can't show up because of money. And it was quite a deep thing to think about. But I know that I've got one daughter, and I would have liked to have had more children, is quite honest. But at the end of the day, one of the main factors that we didn't have more children was financial, was being able to provide for more children, and that was a big factor. So you've talked about family, and how does money affect that family unit? Because you do cover this in the book in detail, but you talked about showing up, and how does that, our current monetary system, how do you say that affects our ability to show up as parents specifically?
So that's a really, really good point. And first off as well, I'd like to just say, I really appreciate the analogy you gave, the story kind of around Christmas and hanging out with your friends, because I think that, to your point, so many of these topics that people want to discuss, we're simply talking about the symptom, and people aren't able to step back and realize, guys, there's an underlying root cause to all of this. And if we just fix the root cause, which is the money, I do believe that we can resolve so many of the challenges that we face in society. And the war in Ukraine is a perfect one. When we can fund wars endlessly, then we're going to have these indefinite wars. Whereas on a system whereby you have a finite supply of currency, one, that means the government is unable to print. And two, that means the government can go to war, but it's going to be very limited in its ability to do so. So first off, it's got to save to be able to go to war, which obviously takes time. And second, if it does start going to war and it realizes that, oh man, we're outgunned, we can't win this war, it's going to end that war very quickly and secede. And I think that's really interesting because it changes the dynamics. It's no wonder that in the 21st century, we have seen more deaths in war proportionate to any other time in history. And that's because at the moment we can fund wars endlessly. That has not been the case throughout history when we've been on monetary standards such as the gold standard, where it's limited our capacity somewhat. Fiat standard, it's no longer the case. But anyway, to answer your question, I think the family unit is really, really fascinating because, again, a lot of people would say, oh, what has money got to do with family? And you're seeing it. To me, it is very apparent that in society today, people don't want to have kids. Where I live in what's called the Sea to Sky, it's Vancouver up to Whistler here in Canada. I know barely anyone that has kids. Millennials are not having kids because when the average house price is $1 million plus, they don't even know what their future holds. They don't know if they're going to be able to put a roof over their own head, let alone put a roof over their kid's head. And so when you've got this uncertainty around the future, all of a sudden you start compromising on thinking about the future. You start compromising about on thinking about whether or not you're going to have kids, whether or not you're going to go on holiday, whether or not you're going to aspire to these bigger, grander goals. And so today, in most places, most Western nations, the fertility rate, the birth rate has dropped below 2.2, which is the replacement rate. The average couple should be having 2.2 kids to be able to take into account the people that don't have kids and people dying. So at the moment, we're not actually replacing our population. So we're starting to see population decline, population stagnation. And like a perfect example of this is like China. China, because of their one-child policy, over the next 50 years is expected to see a 50% decline in their population. That's just mind-blowing. And then you think about like Canada. Canada, for over the next, I think it's like the next 10 to 15 years is going to see a 60% increase in people 60 and above and only a 10% increase in 60 and below. So we're getting these huge aging populations because people aren't having kids anymore. And so you wonder why this is happening. And this is because, I would argue again, it's the money. Everything is downstream of money. But to kind of put this in perspective, I like to try and think about how money shapes how we as individuals show up, because it makes things way more clearer. So I'll touch on 3 points, which I touch on in the book. The first one is money alters our time preference. So Bitcoiners talk about this thing called time preference. And think of it as like a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you've got high time preference thinking, which is I'm impulsive. I'm going to meet my immediate needs. I'm not thinking about anything in the future. I just want to meet my immediate needs. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got low time preference thinking, which is I'm thinking about security and prosperity for the future. And I'm going to do what is best for my future self at the expense of maybe meeting those immediate needs. Now, what is interesting is when you've got money that is facing massive inflation because of government intervention, where our cost of living is constantly rising. As I mentioned, all of a sudden, we're now incentivized to consume over save, given that our purchasing power is deteriorating. So because we're incentivized to consume over save, we lean into this society where we're very impulsive. We're trying to meet our immediate needs. And not only that, but when you've got things like house prices completely outpacing any form of wage growth, it becomes very hard to plan. So if we can't think about how we're ever going to afford a house, people don't think about family. People don't think about having kids. They're simply thinking about how do I put food on the table? How do I survive in this moment? So we have a society that is constantly trending towards higher time preference thinking, more impulsive behavior. And you can feel that. I'm sure most people listening can feel that. And then the second one is meaninglessness. So when we think about society today, because our cost of living is constantly rising, because house prices are skyrocketing, because it is harder to be able to pursue the things that motivate us, all of a sudden it's really easy for meaninglessness to set in. And you can see this in society. We've got the highest rates of depression, highest rates of anxiety, highest rates of drug use, suicide, highest rates of nihilism. People don't feel like they've got a future because it's just like, how, if a house is $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, and that's the average price of a house in your area, how are you ever going to afford that on an entry-level wage or even a mid-tier wage? You're not. And so it's very easy for these mental health issues to kind of start percolating throughout society. So again, money is influencing our mental health. It's influencing our ability to find meaning in life because we can't actually pursue anything that motivates us. And then the final one that I'll just share is kind of like compassion and altruism. And I find that in psychology, there's this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's kind of like a triangle, and there's kind of multiple tiers to this triangle. And the base of this triangle, the foundation, is our food and shelter. To be able to ever think about relationships, giving back in society, more spiritual beliefs, we need to at first set that foundation of food and shelter. If we can't meet our basic needs of food and shelter, how are we ever meant to be able to think about giving back and having compassion for others? And so in today's society, what I find is that we're increasingly limited in our capacity to give back to community, to be altruistic, because our money is limiting our ability to do so because we're squeezed so financially. And so all of these three things are now impacting the family. And the perfect example of that is if you take a look at in Canada here, and I'm sure it's the same in the UK, I'm sure it's the same in the US, it's the same in Japan. in 1970, compared to now, what we've seen is a doubling of dual earner households with both parents having to go and work, and a halving of single earner households. So what this is highlighting is that our cost of living is becoming so expensive that both parents having to go out and work. If both parents having to go out and work, then kids aren't getting their emotional needs met to the same extent. So again, it's no wonder that we're seeing high rates of depression, anxiety, drug use, you name it, because kids have never had their emotional needs met. And that's increasingly becoming apparent. And so I'd say money intimately impacts our ability to meet our needs and our kids' needs, family, you name it.
I think what you do so well is you explore the second and third and fourth order effects of having this faulty money, basically. So you don't just stop at if parents can't be around for their children as much, they're working more and more, so they're spending less time at home. You then follow up with what effect that actually has on children, and obviously in that initial moment, it's a lack of attention. It's you talk about children being more reliant on their peers rather than getting that attention from their own parents. But then you go even further and look into things like rising cases of ADHD and autism, and all these things are, like you say, they are downstream of money. But for most people, they're so far downstream that perhaps people can't make that causal link. But I think you do that really, really well. You mentioned obviously time preference and consumerism as well. Last person I spoke to was Knut Svanholm. I'm sure you probably know. And he talked about consumerism as well. And how do you think then moving from an unsound money to a monetary standard that would be sound? So in this case, we're obviously advocate for Bitcoin in this case. How would that change people's attitude towards consumerism? You obviously touched on time preference. What is it about Bitcoin that would actually help to change that?
For sure. So it's a really good question. And I think that, like, to your point, which you made, sometimes people struggle to dig below the surface. We get stuck on these superficial issues. We get stuck talking about the symptoms. And for me, Jeff Booth talks about this. Many other incredible individuals talk about this, which is just this first principles thinking. It's trying to dig below the surface. And I'd say the person who described it best is the founder of Toyota. His name's like Takeshi Toyota or something. I probably butchered his name. But anyway, he said something along the lines of, he had this strategy in his kind of factories, which is the 5 whys. Anytime we have a problem, ask, why is that happening? And then we're going to get one layer deep. And then once we've figured out why that is happening, we've asked again, why is this thing happening? And you keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper until you think you hit that base layer. And so for me personally, when you start asking, man, I notice we've got a lot of consumerism in society. Why is this happening? Well, we've then got to ask, well, people are buying goods. They're incentivized to buy goods. What is causing this? And then you start digging deeper and you realize it's the money. And you only need to go down a few layers to get back to the money. But anyway, talking about kind of your question, I would say that, so I briefly touched on it. In our current society, because money is worth less over time, because of monetary intervention, because we're printing more monetary units, and when more monetary units are chasing the same amount of goods, prices rise. So because our money is worth less over time, we're now incentivized to save, given that our purchasing power is greatest in this present moment. So this is just a subconscious incentive for us, is to go out there and spend our money because it's going to be worth less tomorrow than it is today. And you see this over and over and over again throughout society. Now, what is interesting is, let's take Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin has a finite supply, there will only ever be 21 million, this flips everything on its head. Society is always trying to get more for less. Technology, efficiency, productivity are all there trying to do more with less. And a perfect example of that would be like Netflix versus Blockbuster. If you take Blockbuster, you used to have to drive down to Blockbuster, spend half an hour in Blockbuster choosing your movie. You'd then go rent the movie. You drive all the way back home again, expending time, energy, and gas. And then you'd watch the movie. You've got to drive back to Blockbuster again, drop off the movie, drive back home. So you've now gone back and forth 4 times, expending all of that time and energy to watch one movie. And now, for almost the same cost as one movie, you can have Netflix at your fingertips. You can have millions of movies at your fingertips. And so technology, if you were to simplify it down to one statement of what technology is, it is trying to do more with less. So over time, prices should be falling, but because the government is printing more money, because the government is intervening monetarily, unfortunately, money printing is outpacing technological advancement. And so what that means is if we had a monetary system with a fixed supply, such is the case with Bitcoin with 21 million, all of a sudden, prices would fall over time because we're increasing efficiency, we're increasing productivity. So if prices were falling over time, that's the same as saying our purchasing power is increasing. So over time, we're able to buy more. We have more capacity. Our cost of living is falling. So if our cost of living is falling and we have more capacity, and in the future, we're able to buy even more or to be able to pursue our endeavors to a greater extent, now we're starting to shift into that low time preference thinking. If our future self, if our future self has the capacity to save and deter or defer immediate gratification, we're going to be rewarded handsomely. So all of a sudden, we start to have a low time preference thinking economy where we start to look inwards, and because we have more capacity, we can start asking, how do I want to show up in life? What is it that actually motivates me? And this is what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin, is Bitcoin, ironically, gets us to stop thinking about money. I think that it grounds us more spiritually and it connects us more, because rather than focusing on spending our money being consumerist and trying to look to goods to find happiness, because we're incentivized to think long term, we start thinking a lot more deeply about how we want to show up as individuals. And so I think that Bitcoin ultimately is an incredible tool for changing how we interact in society, for creating a more grounded, more authentic society where we have greater capacity. And that, I think, is absolutely incredible. All of a sudden, consumerism drops off because we're actually incentivized to save over consume.
I think Bitcoin almost takes sort of thinking about money, it takes it out of the equation, because in most cases when you say you're thinking about money, it's actually anxiety and it's worry. And being able to save in something, like you say, that has a fixed supply, that the purchasing power is going to increase into the future, it gives you that stable platform to be able to plan for the future. And like I say, to be able to concentrate on other things rather than money. So actually, by having sound money, it lets you stop thinking about money. So you also talked a little bit about, use the word nihilism. And I think, I mean, the technical definition of nihilism is sort of an apathy towards everything, but also not believing in being an atheist as well, isn't it? I think it's not believing in a higher power, or just not believing in the value of life. What did you sort of mean by that, this sort of rise in nihilism and apathy?
So it's tough, and we'll pull up the actual definition of nihilism, because I think there's a few different interpretations of what nihilism is. But I would say, for me personally, what's the actual? Nihilism is a philosophical viewpoint that rejects fundamental aspects of human existence, such as morality, knowledge, or meaning. So that's kind of like the general definition of nihilism. But for me, what I find is that people want to have this, I feel like people are drawn towards showing up in like an integral way, having morality, trying to give back to society, and they feel as if the world supports them to a certain extent, and those around them ultimately support them. And I think that when we live in a society where everything feels like it's against you, where it feels like our cost of living is constantly rising, we can't get by, we can't pursue the things that we want, all of a sudden it's really easy for these ideas of human existence and morality and meaning to fall off the wayside. And you see this more and more and more when it comes to millennials, for instance, where people are just like, I'm never going to be able to afford a house. I'm never going to be able to have kids. Like, what is the point of life? Because they just can't get by. And so to me, I think that if we were to move towards some form of sound money, such as Bitcoin, it sets that foundation whereby instead of things getting harder and harder and harder, things get easier and easier and easier. And so if things are getting easier and people have more capacity to show up, that is huge. They can start to show up more authentically. And by showing up more authentically and having more capacity to lean into the things that motivate them, then in turn, they can find more meaning in life. And so those three little areas of psychology that I touched on, the low and high time preference, the meaninglessness and the compassion and altruism. I truly believe that if we were to move towards a sound money, we would move away from high time preference thinking, move towards low time preference thinking. That more, I'm thinking about the long term, the future, security, prosperity. And then you think about meaninglessness. Well, I think we would move towards meaning, where we would all of a sudden, because we have more capacity to pursue the things that motivate us, we would find meaning in life. That is huge. And then compassion and altruism. Today we're sucked dry because we're constantly trying to survive. And there's a famous quote, which is, fear closes our aperture of awareness. When we are scared, all of a sudden our aperture of awareness is focused on surviving. Our aperture of awareness is focused on food and shelter. Whereas all of a sudden, as we start to have more capacity, our aperture of awareness widens. So we start thinking about others. We start thinking about community. We start thinking about wanting to raise a family. So to me, a world built upon sound money, all of a sudden has the opposite effect to what we're having today, which is nihilism. People start to find meaning in life. They find purpose in life. And this goes back to this whole idea that the ironic thing about money is it gets us to stop thinking about money. It gets us to start thinking more about how we want to show up, which is huge.
You also said about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think at the moment, I certainly feel as though I'm being kind of pushed further down that pyramid shape to sort of look at the bottom rung, and I'm spending more and more of my time earning money to satisfy those needs. But being on a sound money platform would allow you to basically concentrate further up. And the further up you go, there's obviously things like self-fulfillment, but that would also include giving back, like you say, giving back to community, being altruistic, being generous. And I do think that's a very important byproduct, possibly the most important byproduct of being on a sound money principle.
I was gonna add one point quickly to that, which is a few years ago, I had an incredibly inspiring individual who has had a lot of success in life share something with me. And he said that today, unfortunately, the world we live in focuses on what are called the 3 Ps. So when we goal set, we're always setting around these 3 Ps, which are power, prestige, and possessions. We want the newest car. We want the Lamborghini. We want power. We want prestige in society. We want to hold the job role that others look up to. But when we actually ask ourselves, what are the most, if you think back to 2 or 3 of your favorite moments throughout life and stop and pause for a second and think about those and then ask yourself, what are they? They're never power, prestige, or possessions. It's not when you bought this car. It's not when you got this newest job. Instead, it is the 3 Cs, which are challenges, contributions, and connections. It's when we connect with others and build friendship and family. It's when we challenge ourselves and we do things that we didn't think we could do. We push ourselves outside of our box. So there's a challenge, contribution, connections. Yeah, relationships and connections, family, you name it. And so I would say that for us, when you start moving towards a Bitcoin standard or even just a sound money standard in general, all of a sudden it becomes far more apparent that our happiness is not built upon power, prestige, and possessions. It is built upon challenges, contributions, and connections.
Couldn't agree more. I don't know sort of what your entry into Bitcoin was like, but I kind of I've probably got COVID to thank personally. That was probably the thing above all else that, and I won't go deeply into it, but probably got my spidey senses tingling a little bit and got me to critically think a little bit more, let's say. So it was no coincidence that I kind of went down the rabbit hole in sort of the second half of 2020. And I feel quite privileged that while I was doing that, that was around about the time that Michael Saylor was doing the rounds on podcasts and had, bought Bitcoin for the first time and had turned MicroStrategy into sort of a Bitcoin, having a Bitcoin treasury. And one of the things, he obviously has this website called hope.com, which is a great resource for anyone who sort of wants to look at it. But there was an interview that he did where he talked about his reason for putting MicroStrategy on a Bitcoin standard, and it was basically a loss of hope. He spent sort of 20, 30 years in the software business trying to sort of fight Microsoft, realized that he couldn't compete, he couldn't grow enough. And when he worked out that the money supply was growing on average by 7%, that this hurdle rate was much, much higher, and he knew that he couldn't grow it. He couldn't grow it by 10% a year. So Bitcoin kind of restored this element of hope. And I wouldn't say my own business journey has been sort of similar to Michael Saylor's, but I've run a small business for about 16 years, and I've just seen it probably get 10% more difficult year on year. And this idea of like a loss of hope, it really resonates, because you also talk in your book about this idea of like a locus of control, and I felt, I've never heard that phrase before, but I've felt that no matter what I did in this business, I couldn't raise my prices enough to keep up with what was happening. And at first, I didn't really know why this was happening until probably about 4 years ago. Once you do realise, you become a little bit nihilistic, really, because you realise that there's not really much you can do. Until sort of Bitcoin came along. Can you just sort of talk about this idea of like a locus of control and what that means? And because, like I said, that's something I hadn't heard of before, and that was really interesting.
Absolutely. And I think it very much ties into this whole idea of like meaningless and meaning. So locus of control in psychology, and there are countless studies on locus of control, and they're basically looking at whether or not on one end of the spectrum, again, it's a spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, people with internal locus of control believe that they have control over their trajectory. They have control over their life. If they make changes in their life, it will reflect outside in the world around them. If they want to go start a business, they can start pursuing that journey, and they can hopefully make that thing happen. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people with an external locus of control, which is the inverse. It's people that believe, I don't have control over my life. The world ultimately governs my trajectory. And what is interesting is countless studies show that people with an external locus of control have lower life expectancy, they have worse health outcomes, they have worse mental health, depression, anxiety, again, you name it, all of these things we've been discussing. People with an internal locus of control tend to have much greater health outcomes, longer life expectancy, much higher rates of happiness, self-confidence, you name it. And this is huge. And what's interesting is when you start interacting in the Bitcoin space and you start going to these Bitcoin events, these Bitcoin communities, all of a sudden you notice people, there's a lot more self-confidence, not in a toxic way. People are just a lot more, they carry themselves with a happiness. They feel like they can show up more authentically in life. They're willing to share their opinions. They don't feel suppressed. And so what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin is Bitcoin, just because we're changing our monetary unit, we're starting to see our purchasing power increase over time and have more capacity. It's altering how people are seeing the world. They start to realize, hey, I do have potential. I do have the ability to start pursuing things that motivate me. As your purchasing power increases, you can pursue hobbies that were potentially out of reach previously. You can support your family in ways that otherwise you wouldn't have been able to. And so whatever that is to you that motivates you, many times Bitcoin allows you to do that, which starts shifting your locus of control, internal and away from external, which I think is massive. And for me personally, I've noticed this immensely. Going into the pandemic, you're talking about kind of your story down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin. I was curious about Bitcoin more as like an interest, not necessarily as an investment, through kind of 2017, 18, 19. But I didn't really start to go deep down the rabbit hole until 2020. And the big turning point for me was that I had a small little apartment. And in December of 2019, I felt like the world was on its knees. And I was like, you know what? I think we're about to go into a depression. So I'm going to go and sell this apartment, and you never know, maybe I'll be able to buy it back cheaper. And then the pandemic hit, and I was like, my God, I've just timed the market. This is freaking amazing. Hopefully I can buy back the house half price. And then we saw the government inject trillions of dollars into the economy, and house prices, that house that I sold in 2019 is now 3 times the price that I sold it for. And so all of a sudden it slammed me. I was just like, this seems very manipulated. Like, I thought we were in some form of a free market, and given how much debt we had, if we had gone into a recession, we should have seen a huge collapse, and we didn't. Instead, we saw monetary intervention paper over all the cracks. And so from there, it became very apparent that we've got an issue with our monetary system and what is causing this. And that led me deeper down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin. And to me, as I've gone down that rabbit hole, it's altered how I'm showing up. It's allowed me to focus more on what it is that motivates me, giving back to society, I've just absolutely loved being able to write and contribute to the community. And that's something that I didn't have the capacity to do prior to the pandemic. And so to me, Bitcoin has absolutely changed my trajectory for sure.
I mean, this sort of locus of control thing, going back to that, Bitcoin, it basically gives you control back, and that's kind of what I felt as well. And this, you said about the apartment sort of tripling in price. The first guest I had on was Jeff Booth, actually, so I was really sort of privileged to have him. And the first thing he says is basically the free market is deflationary. So we've never lived in a free market, and if the pandemic had sort of been allowed to play out, those house prices would have done exactly what you said, that you would have been able to buy back cheaper. So this idea that we have a free market is we've never had one, and this, what we have is a completely interventionist market, and that's, as you say, that's why money was injected. And I mean, 2020 was insane, really, what happened. And then obviously they talked about inflation being transitory and all this, and it's just lies after lies after lies. But for most people, they're not sort of aware of what's going on or why it's happening. But so just going to sort of change that a little bit. You've talked sort of a bit later on, just while we're sort of on the subject of COVID, without wanting to get sort of shadow banned before I start. But one thing that I found really, really interesting, which I'd kind of heard a little bit before, was you discussed the works of Matthias Desmet, who's a professor, and you talked about this idea of mass formation. Could you just sort of outline what that is and where that sort of comes from, and what you talked about in the book with that, please?
For sure. So Matthias Desmet he's a super fascinating individual, and I'd say he is to give him kind of a little bit of a background, he's the professor of psychology at Ghent University in, I think it's Belgium. And he is kind of like that foremost expert in authoritarian and totalitarianism structures. And so mass formation, effectively, if you were to just like really, really simplify it down, refers to basically mob rule, or like a large crowd where their collective behavior influences the individuals within it. So people are willing to give up their rights and freedoms, or give up their own beliefs for the collective interest of the crowd. And so that's the idea that people become sheep. And so you got to ask the question, why does that happen? Well, that happens for a few reasons. If we're living in a society where we have sound money and people have capacity, people are not going to defer their thinking onto other people. People only tend to defer their thinking onto other people or give into mob rule when they feel as if they don't have any future. They're finding meaningless in life. And so in this book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which is the book that Matthias Desmet wrote, he talks about the 4 stages of totalitarianism. And he says in every single instance that he has researched, whether we're talking about Mao Zedong, whether we're talking about Stalin, whether we're talking about Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il in North Korea, all of these instances basically have the same precursors. So the first one is loneliness. People in society, when we're working because we're financially strapped and we have to put ourselves into work 6 days, sometimes even 7 days a week, all of a sudden it's very easy for loneliness to kick in, because we just don't have the capacity to go out and socialize. And everyone else is also just working their ass off trying to get by. So that's kind of the first precursor. People start feeling lonely in society. And then next up is meaninglessness. When people are struggling financially to survive, and to everything that we've discussed so far, people aren't able to plan for the future. They don't know if they're ever going to own a house. They don't know if they're going to be able to have a family. It's very easy for meaninglessness to set in. So if you're lonely and you don't have meaning in life, then all of a sudden you start to develop the third stage, free-floating widespread anxiety. So free-floating meaning it's not attached to anything. If I was standing next to a giant cliff and I had a fear of heights, that is not free-floating. That is anxiety because I'm standing right next to a cliff. If I don't really understand why I'm just feeling tense the whole time, I'm feeling uncomfortable, it's kind of this free-floating widespread anxiety, what ends up happening is we've got a society that's lonely. we've got a society that is struggling to find meaning, and now they're very anxious because they just don't really understand why they're not getting ahead, then it's really easy for condition 4 to set in, which is aggression and frustration. All of a sudden, and there's a quote in the book that he says, which is, if under the aforementioned circumstances, a suggestive story is spread through the mass media that indicates an object of anxiety, and at the same time offers a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, there's a real chance that all the free-floating anxiety will attach itself to that object, and there'll be broad social support for the implementation of a strategy to control that object of anxiety. And so what this means is when people are feeling lonely, when they're not finding meaning in life, when there's this anxiety, and now they've got this aggression and frustration built up, if someone comes out and says, hey, this is the reason for your anxiety, such as the case with Hitler and the Jewish population, or such as the case with North Korea and capitalism in the West, and it's the same with Mao Zedong, then all of a sudden you can get this kind of mob brawl, whether or not it's legitimate or not, and people disregard their beliefs, and they're willing to have this collective belief, and they're willing to slam people. And we've seen this during the pandemic. We've seen everybody give up on their beliefs and all of a sudden point the finger at a certain group of individuals that didn't get some form of injection in their arm. And so we've seen this over and over and over again, that people are willing to just attack others with no foundational belief behind it. So this is mass formation or mob rule. Now, what's interesting is he says this is kind of what ends up happening in order for totalitarianism to kind of like really percolate throughout society. But I would say he's missing one foundational condition. And that foundational condition to me is broken money. If you don't have broken money, if you have sound money where people are able to save, people have capacity, then it's far harder for loneliness and meaninglessness to step in. And so if it's far harder for people to find that loneliness because they've got greater capacity, they're able to show up in life more authentically, they're able to find meaning in life, then all of a sudden, I truly do believe that we would massively minimize the amount of totalitarian authoritarianism in society today. And when I say it's the global society, I would say the global economy, because most of those nations, they're struggling financially. People have no hope without government intervention. People are basically under the thumb of government. So if people have more capacity to consciously think about the information they're consuming, to be able to give back to society, to pursue what it is that interests them, I think it'd be far harder for totalitarian structures to arise. And on top of that, if you had a sound money, the government wouldn't be able to print funds anyway and support its operations without support from the populace. So that breaks down totalitarianism.
And that obviously was certainly a precursor to World War II in Germany, the hyperinflation of the currency. So Hitler was able to, like you say, there was a free-floating anxiety that Hitler was able to attach to a certain group of people. And yeah, that's how that worked. So just pulling on that thread a little bit, it's probably fair to say there's still free-floating anxiety. There probably always is. If there is an economic collapse, which we could be on the verge of, it would seem to me that Bitcoiners would be ripe to be that group of people that could have that free-floating anxiety attached to them and targeted. Is that something that sort of concerns you, that things, obviously, there's a bright orange future over here, but there is a means of getting there, and could it get worse before it gets better, and could Bitcoiners be a target in a similar way, blamed for things that they're not responsible for, but in a similar way to that we saw during the pandemic?
That's a really interesting question, because I would say that, like, when you start stepping back and you start just looking objectively at the economy, and most economies globally, you realize that people are so reliant on the government. Like in the UK, I think it's something like, I think there's a quote in the book, and don't quote me on this, but it's something like 56% of British citizens receive more in benefits than they pay in taxes. How is that a functioning economy when over half of the population receive more in benefits than they pay in taxes? That's just insane. And it's the same in like the US. It's the same in Canada. It's in the US, 2/3 of the population live paycheck to paycheck. So you're talking about individuals that are very much on their knees, and they are reliant on government intervention, government subsidies, government grants, you name it. And because of that, I think that these populations are ripe for more authoritarian, totalitarian control. Now, we're already starting to see this. I think sometimes when you look back throughout history, we think about these extreme cases, such as Stalin, such as Mao Zedong, such as Kim Il-sung. We see these extreme cases of totalitarianism, but what we don't talk about is that I don't think that the totalitarianism, authoritarianism today is going to look the same. I think it is, we're going to have free speech suppressed on social media. We're not going to be able to say what it is that we want. In the UK, if you even vocalize some of that you don't agree with certain beliefs, people are being put in prison simply by sharing their opinion. And so in a sense, these are aspects of totalitarianism starting to show themselves. It may not be across all of society, but it's definitely showing itself in some areas of society. What is interesting is that I think Bitcoin has had a full frontal attack for the last 4 or 5 years, especially since kind of 2020, 2021, where we started to see more nation state adoption, where the media, the New York Times, was slamming Bitcoin, trying to paint Bitcoin as bad, paint Bitcoin as negative, attaching the whole environmental movement towards, well, Bitcoin is boiling the oceans. We've also just seen recently, I think it may have been the New York Times, it said something like, Bitcoin is the new white privilege. And this was posted just like a week ago. And so again, what they're trying to do is paint Bitcoin as a scapegoat. They're trying to push Bitcoin as the issues that we're facing today and completely mask and kind of keep the veil over the fact that, no, the issues we face today have got nothing to do with Bitcoin. The issues we face today are actually the antithesis. They've got everything to do with our current monetary system that is impacting people's ability to show up. But what I'm hoping, and Jeff Booth talks about this, is can Bitcoiners build the financial bridge over to Bitcoin quick enough so that people are starting to realize, hey, it becomes easier and less painful to transition to a new system than it is to remain in the current system. The government's ability to intervene and support or give subsidies to its populace is getting less and less and less without massive inflation or without huge wealth inequality. And so at some point, it becomes easier to transition to the new system than stay in the old system. And I think that's what we're starting to see now. There's enough Bitcoiners in society. They're not a tiny, tiny, tiny niche group anymore that most people know a Bitcoiner or two that have benefited from Bitcoin, and they're sharing their stories, and they're starting to wonder, is that possible for me? And so I think this is the time for Bitcoiners to be able to step up, support education initiatives, to be able to work in Bitcoiner-based companies to raise awareness to the fact that, hey, we do have this parallel system, that life is becoming easier. It's not getting harder. And we're not the enemy. We're actually the ally that is trying to help support you. And I think I definitely think that's the narrative that we should be.
I think it helps that there's some truly wonderful people, wonderful advocates for Bitcoin as well. So I think that definitely helps. I think I'm perhaps a little bit biased in that I'm in the UK, so what you've just said there completely resonates because we've had some. I mean, to live in the UK and be sort of saying things like this now, I can hardly believe it. But like I think it was 3,300 people imprisoned in. It was either last year, it was either 2022 or 2023 in the UK served custodial sentences for things that they said online, which is, it's shocking. We've only got a prison population of about 80,000, so it's quite a big proportion of people. I think the Overton window in the US is changing. I think that, like you say, things that were you couldn't have talked about even sort of 2 years ago are now being talked about. I think certainly the narrative around Bitcoin energy fraud is something that has changed. So hopefully, with that administration, like I say, the Overton window is now shifted to allow like true conversations and debate to be had. I think I lost my thread a little bit there. But
well, I would even what you're saying as well. Like I would say, in there's a famous depiction. I think it's called the Aurora boar, and it's the snake that's eating its tail. And our current system, these kind of very interventionistic socialist systems, I think they are perceived as the saving grace to capitalism. That, hey, if we want to support society, we want to have DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're going to transfer wealth from the rich to the poor, we're going to do all of these amazing things. And what they forget is that may work in theory, but in practice, it does not work. Where the people in society that add value to society are the productive class. And when you take the productive class, when you take value from the productive class and give it to others, you disincentivize productivity. And not only that, but when you start handing money to people for free, you also disincentivize those individuals from putting themselves out there. And so the society starts eating itself. And it's what we're facing right now. The snake is eating its tail. And you start to see these socialist systems, they continually break down over time, and they end up leading to absolute chaos. Whereas what people want, what people need, is to feel like they can contribute to society and they're rewarded for that contribution to society. And so I think it's so important that we reinstate more free market economics, more Austrian economics, whereby people benefit from their labor, their minds, their ability to give back to society, as opposed to the society where, just like in the UK, over half the population receive more benefits than they pay in taxes. That's just totally unfunctional.
Once you sort of shift the incentives in that direction, then, like I say, the second and third order effects are shocking, really. I think in order to sort of make that bridge possible, you touched on free speech as well. Are you on Nostr by any chance? Have you discovered Nostr yet? Yeah. So I think things like that, which I believe only existed for like 2 years, are going to be a big part of that. Obviously, it's a very sort of small protocol at the moment, but at least it lets people have these true conversations and true debates. And I think education and just having honest questions and continually being able to put things out there that are ultimately the truth, and we do have the truth on our side, and hopefully, I mean, you mentioned right at the start that we are all Satoshi, and I know that's something that Knut says, I know that's something that Jeff says as well, that it has to work because it is just made up of us at the end of the day. So hopefully it will happen. One of the concerns that I've had, and again, I've got sort of Jeff to thank for this, is he talks about as long as it stays decentralized and secure, and the base layer of Bitcoin obviously has stayed decentralized and secure for 16 years now. And it's probably beyond the point now where the powers that be feel that they can actually corrupt the base layer. So Jeff talks about how if they can't corrupt the base layer, they're going to attack it as a medium of exchange, attack it on the second layer. That appears to me to be happening. I don't know how much time you sort of spend on Bitcoin Twitter. I try to spend a bit more time on Nostr these days, but when I have spent time on Bitcoin Twitter over the last few months, there seems to be this big debate over self-custody. And to me, Bitcoin has to become a medium of exchange in order to not go the same way as gold. I just wondered what your thought, whether you had thoughts on that, whether that was a concern of yours, because, as I say, Jeff has mentioned this, and to me, this attack on self-custody seems to be the beginning of this, trying to sort of shift this narrative towards, well, don't keep it yourself, we'll look after it for you, we'll centralize it here, you can trust us. And really, self-custody is the whole point in order for you to be able to transact peer-to-peer. So I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, whether that's a threat vector.
For sure. No, that it's interesting because I haven't actually spoken about this too much on podcasts, but I would say that this custody issue is a unique one. When it came to gold, you can, of course, take custody of your gold. The problem with gold is that it's physical in nature. And so that's fine if you've got a few gold rings or you name it, some little gold bars. But the moment you start getting more than a few gold rings, a few gold bars, it becomes very hard and cumbersome to look after your gold. Not only that, if you live in an apartment, if you live in kind of a dense living space, do you want to be custodying your gold? Can you custody it in a secure manner? And so what that meant is that people ended up leaving their gold with their custodian over time. And then that is what allowed kind of the centralization of gold holdings and the rehypothecation or the paperization of gold, where people ended up basically, the banks would print way more what is the word? Basically, they would there'd be a lot more gold in
there's a lot more paper claims on gold than there is actual gold. Yeah.
there's a lot more there's a lot more paper gold than there is claims on gold. Anyway, and actual gold and reserves. And so anyway, what is interesting about Bitcoin is that I am not opposed to custodians, but what needs to happen is we need to have efficient means of self-custody. If we've got efficient means of self-custody, so anyone can go and order a device, a hardware device, and easily and almost effortlessly move their funds from an exchange onto their device, then what that does down the line is that it means that bank runs become incredibly easy. And so all of a sudden, these custodians, these centralized entities, they have to act in the best interest of the individual, because otherwise you're going to see an FTX. Otherwise, you're going to see a Celsius, where all of a sudden people can withdraw, and within a 5-hour period, that bank can go from solvent to insolvent overnight if it starts to create more paper claims on its Bitcoin than it has in reserves. And so I think this is really, really fascinating. At the moment, we're not there yet. I think that a lot of the banks act in traditional ways, and they are rehypothecating. I think a lot of these entities, it would not surprise me in the slightest if they do not have the reserves they say. And so because of that, I urge everyone to take some form of either collaborative custody or self-custody. I think that's incredibly important. But in the future, I think once banks realize, hey, we cannot mess with our customers' funds. If we start messing with our customers' funds and we have a bank run, even if we have 50% of the funds, we could very quickly become insolvent. And so I think because of that, Bitcoin incentivizes collaboration. Bitcoin incentivizes an environment where banks have to act on behalf of the customer. That's not the case at the moment with pretty much every other asset that we have globally. And so, but I should preface that with, we're not there yet. I think that we need to see more innovation in the self-custody space, because with Looking Glass, you mentioned at the start, I co-founded Looking Glass with a few incredible individuals. And one of the aspects of Looking Glass that we have is called coddle. Coddle is kind of the overprotective approach to self-custody. So we've helped hundreds of people through their self-custody. And what I've come to realize is that, unfortunately, most people are technically inept. Most people don't know Control-C, Control-V on the keyboard and can barely move files around on their computer. And because of that, self-custody is incredibly intimidating. And so I think self-custody is great for those that are willing to go deep down the rabbit hole, but it's a little intimidating for people that are not necessarily technically inclined, or people that are, or that they're busy in life. They're high net worth individuals that have their day job, and all of a sudden they've got to learn about self-custody. And so I think that what we're starting to see is the increase in things like collaborative custody as a hybrid solution. You're distributing trust across multiple entities. And I think that is another amazing option. And you've got companies like the Bitcoin Advisor, which are doing things like that. And I think in time, we're going to transition to a multitude of platforms. But because there is an ease of transacting and moving funds on chain into your own self-custodial wallet, all of a sudden that disincentivizes rehypothecation. It disincentivizes creating paper claims on Bitcoin. So I think that we're not there yet, but I do think we're going to see a shift over time and away from that as we start to get more innovation, more technology in that space.
I think as long as there's a healthy subset of people who do self-custody, then that can kind of act as the check and balance on these sort of central custodians. Because, I mean, do you actually think that there are sort of paper claims on Bitcoin right now? Then do you think that's the case? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I think that what's challenging as well is that when a lot of these exchanges get audited, so you can go and get an audit whereby the auditor says, hey, look, they have this amount of Bitcoin in reserves. But the problem is, if you read the fine print many times, yes, they may have that Bitcoin in reserves, but by holding it on the exchange, they have an IOU to you. Yeah. You do not have a direct claim to that asset. So if you do not have a direct claim to that asset, and that company has liabilities, that exchange has liabilities, those liabilities may supersede your claim. And so this is what we've seen over and over again. So we can have these audits, but it doesn't matter if they have massive liabilities and the company goes under. So I think being able to separate customer funds from the company's balance sheet in terms of their own liabilities is incredibly important, and that's not the case with many exchanges. So that's where I absolutely urge, like I still very much believe we're in the stage where you need to move funds from into collaborative custody or self-custody and away from centralized custodians, because at the moment we still very much exist underneath the traditional TradFi world, where we have to place immense trust in our custodians, and those custodians have abused it.
I think the emergence of like River, and River obviously service the US. I don't think they currently service the UK, unfortunately, but they've started with proof of reserves. And I think what will happen is once one sort of domino falls, that will create an incentive for other exchanges to follow suit, because River are gonna grow basically because of these proof of reserves that because they're showing absolute transparency and honesty. They're going to attract more customers, and hopefully that will place demand on other exchanges to follow suit. But I certainly think that we should encourage self-custody for people who sort of feel confident enough. I mean, I'm not a technical guy, but I've sort of made the effort to sort of look into it, and I do it, and I did a call with Ben Perrin at BTC Sessions as well. I did like a one-on-one with him and stuff. So there are things out there, and you mentioned BC Advisor and stuff. There are services out there to sort of do the hand holding or the coddling, like I say, because it is scary. It's there is no sort of hotline to call if you mess things up. So tread carefully, but I would encourage people to take those steps.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, like you mentioned, Ben, BTC Sessions, like he started, I think it's called Bitcoin Mentor, BTC Mentor, and it's phenomenal. And so I would highly recommend, like, if you are looking to take self-custody and you're unsure, like reach out to people like the Bitcoin Mentor with Ben. We're more than happy to help with Coddle and Looking Glass. Like, we want to be able to support people in taking self-custody, because the way I look at it is it's similar to node running. Like, in the end, very few people are actually going to run nodes, but it is the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals that are willing to put the time and energy to go and run a node that ultimately supports everyone else to ensure that we don't end up having attacks to the Bitcoin network. And what's interesting as well, you talk about companies like River, where they're doing kind of proof of reserves, is that in the banking sector, and I mentioned this again in the book, like I think it's Caitlin Long, who is a phenomenal individual who has pushed a lot for regulatory clarity in the US surrounding Bitcoin. She has kind of been behind kind of Custodia and I think Narrowbank. She's behind one of them or maybe both of them. And both of these banks in the US applied to basically have 100, and I think even one of them are like 105% reserves. They were fully reserved banks. Now, what's interesting is they were declined. They would decline their banking license. Why? Because they actually expose the fact that our current system does not have 100% reserves. And all of a sudden, if you have this superior bank that there's almost no chance of them going under, what are we going to do? You're going to see a whole bunch of capital flee the traditional banking sector, making the traditional banking sector insolvent as they flood into this new banking sector that is fully reserved. And so I think that the challenge with our current system is it's so fragile that the banking sector, like there's no new banks coming about that are trying to improve that or reduce that fragility, improve that stability, because they actually expose the traditional sector. So I think Bitcoin acts as a parallel system, a system where people can actually take full custody of their Bitcoin. And even if they're not taking custody, hopefully there's companies like River, which are doing proof of reserves. So they're acting as the custodia, the narrow bank that are saying, hey, look, we do not touch our customers' funds. We want to act on behalf of our customer, and they want to act as kind of a stability.
Yeah, and maybe being able to do that without sort of having their hands tied by a corrupt regulator as well. But I think that was a great example in the book, and I'd read about sort of Caitlin Long as well, and I think 108% reserves, and declined basically because they were too safe, and they would expose and show up the ones that weren't. We can't have a safe bank because people will use it, and it's like, so we'll just deny you the banking license, which is, again, like it's astounding, really. So we sort of come to
it's insane. Yeah, and I was just going to say as well, like I listened to a really fascinating talk. When was it? maybe about 18 months ago, and it was actually Caitlin Long on what Bitcoin did. You may be able to find it with Peter McCormack. And one of the things she talked about is the fact that we always talk about intervention and how we need intervention. We need a central bank. They need to add stability. They need to regulate the markets. They need to do this. They need to do that. And what's interesting is she talks about the Depression. And most people, when we talk about the Depression, we're obviously referring to the Great Depression in kind of the late 20s into the 30s. And what we don't talk about is there was a depression in the early 20s. And that depression in the early 20s was just as deep. Asset prices saw supposedly just as big of a drawdown. They saw the same unemployment in the US. But what is interesting is at the time, the central bank didn't have the capacity to intervene to the same extent that it did in the 1930s depression. And so within, it was like 18 months to 2 years, the economy fully recovered, asset prices back up to where they were, employment back up to where it was. But we never talk about that. And we never talk about it because it exposes the fact that we do not need these centralized institutions. We do not need economists that are constantly telling us how we need to adjust monetary policy, how we need to adjust interest rates to be able to protect the economy. Instead, we just need a free market where interest rates fluctuate based upon risk in the economy, where prices are based upon supply and demand. They're not based upon intervention. And in doing so, what that does is it completely eliminates or it disincentivizes fiscal irresponsibility. Because if you're going into a recession and you are hugely levered, you've been fiscally irresponsible, and your balance sheet is basically full of debt, then you're going to be wiped out. And all of a sudden, you've got to support a family. So you've got to get back out there. You've got to start a business. You've got to start adding value to society. And so the economy recovers much quicker. Whereas when we start intervening and bailing out these companies for being fiscally irresponsible, what does it do? It disincentivizes fiscal responsibility. It incentivizes them taking on more debt, taking on more risk, because they know that, hey, if I make a mistake and I go bankrupt, I'm going to be bailed out. And so it's fully misaligned incentives. I think that we need to step back from intervention and allow more free market natural functioning.
On a personal level, when your back's against the wall and you know that you have to sort of step up, then you do. But if someone's there with a helping hand, it's kind of like the sort of the fish and the net analogy, isn't it? It's if you give somebody a fish, they'll eat for a day, and they'll probably just wait for the next day for you to come and give them another one. But I'll look into that because I wasn't aware of that in the early 20s. So I shall read up on that. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Oh, no sweat. And to that fish and net analogy as well, like I mentioned this in the book, and I think it's one of the most profound points in the book, to be honest. And that is, during COVID in Canada, we had something called the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And for those that lost, it was something like greater than 10% of their income because of a result of COVID. They were entitled to $2,000 a month. And so it was like 1 to 2 years, Canadians were basically being given $24,000 a year. Well, when you look at tax receipts, you realize that 1/3 of Canadians earn under $30,000 a year. So all of a sudden, what you've basically done is for 1/3 of Canadians, you've given them the option to quit their job and get paid $2,000 a month, but not add value to society, or go and work and not get that free money, and now all your time is consumed by working. So what happened? All of these Canadians left their jobs, they quit, they got all of this money from the government, and cafes, bike shops, all of these low-income jobs, basically employers couldn't find any staff. And so countless businesses, small businesses, family-owned businesses went under. It completely destroyed the small business industry. And so again, because the government stepped in and wanted to support people, it was trying to do what was best, support the people that are losing income. You disincentivize them actually going to work. So exactly the same as your like fish and net analogy.
I don't just want to sort of rip politicians to shreds, but particularly in the UK, we've got now a Labour front bench. I believe there's nobody that's ever run a business on that front bench. So I, about a year ago, wrote a letter to my MP for the very first time. And you're from the UK, aren't you, originally? Yeah, so in the UK we have VAT, sort of value-added tax, and as a small business, there's a threshold at which you have to register for VAT. And I wrote this letter because this threshold had stayed the same since 2017. It hadn't gone up at all. And I wrote this letter saying it should at least go up by inflation, whatever sort of measure you want to go, but by CPI, it should go up by CPI every year, because obviously your costs are getting higher and higher. Minimum wage is obviously rising each year, but this VAT threshold, this threshold at which you have to register VAT and start charging your customers VAT and paying that to the government, it's staying the same. So the ceiling's staying the same and the floor is just rising all the time. And what the letter I got back from this minister was this argument that we've kept it the same because we want to draw more businesses into paying VAT. And I thought, they just do not understand the incentives. They don't understand the second and third order effects of what's going to happen. And rather than bring these companies into paying VAT, what's going to happen is then they're not going to charge VAT, because they're going to be in competition with other people, other small businesses that are not paying VAT. So to suddenly just add 20% to your prices, it's going to make you completely uncompetitive. So you've got this choice between either staying below the threshold, literally turning away work, being less productive for fear of going over this threshold, or going over the threshold and becoming uncompetitive and potentially going out of business. And this gets more and more complicated if you've got employees. And a lot of these small businesses will be in a position where they've got one employee. And as the minimum wage continues to rise and you get closer and closer to this VAT threshold, what it essentially does is say, I can no longer afford to pay you the minimum wage because my costs have risen. This VAT threshold has stayed here, and I can't grow my way out of it because I will lose my business through lack of competition. But they just do not seem to understand the second and third order effects of the things that they put in place. But like I say, interventionism is the problem. If they simply just got out of the way, GDP would rise because people would be able to do more work, and that's what people want to do. They want to earn more money. They want to be more productive. They don't want to be making all the decisions based on regulations, on tax thresholds, and constantly sort of spinning plates and balancing. But that was just my own little bugbear there. But we've done sort of just over an hour now, so I don't want to sort of keep you too long. But just one more thing I just wanted to sort of talk about was you write this newsletter called the Chi, I think I'm pronouncing it right, the Chi of self-sovereignty. So there was an article that you wrote in November, and it was about spending Bitcoin. And obviously we've talked about high time preference and low time preference. And I think there's a tendency in the Bitcoin community to say we're never selling, we're never going to spend our Bitcoin. But you talk about this idea of wealth, and can you just sort of explain a little bit about that article and where you stand on that? Because I think we probably see things the same way. But yeah, that was an interesting article. So could you sort of just touch on that one, if you can remember which one that was? It was the one from November, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that it's a contentious subject in the world of Bitcoin. But for me personally, when I look at the world, I tend to think that the fiat lens, when we're looking at the world through fiat currencies, the British pound, the US dollar, the Canadian dollar, we're constantly incentivized to consume and spend and spend. And because of that, because life is getting harder, because our money is worth less and less and less, we're just trying to get more and more and more of it as well. And so I think that we have this society where we're just trying to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, consume, accumulate. And it's just like, how do we get out of that rat race? How do we get out of that rat race? And consumption isn't bad if it is improving our life. It's improving our quality of life. It's allowing us to have more capacity to do what it is that we want to be able to go and do. And so what I find interesting is when people are thinking about just endlessly saving Bitcoin to accumulate more and more and more, in a sense, I sometimes think about that's just the fiat mindset replicating in a Bitcoiner. It's you're just trying to get more and more and more for the sake of getting more and more and more. And in reality, the way I look at money is money, we go and expend time and energy, and we're paid in money so that we can then hopefully buy back time and pursue the things that motivate us down the line. And so when it comes to Bitcoin, of course, I absolutely recommend I absolutely recommend saving and trying to improve your quality of life and to be able to have more capacity to pursue what it is that you want to be able to go and pursue. But that also means that when Bitcoin gets to a level where you can start to live maybe a more authentic life, when you can start to go and pursue those things that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to go and pursue, then by all means go and do that. Because what is life if we've just saved our whole life and accumulated more Bitcoin and more wealth? Instead, I'd be urging, if you have capacity to go and spend time with your family, spend more time with your kids, and Bitcoin allows you to do that, then I am in full support of that. If there is a hobby that you've always wanted to do and you feel like it would make a meaningful difference to your life, then go and do that. But I think the key is to not just enter and exit Bitcoin immediately. It's finding that balance between how much Bitcoin allows me to materially change my life, while at the same time not just consuming and spending for the sake of consuming and spending. And so that's a unique question to each and every one of us.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make a distinction between the idea of spending Bitcoin and selling Bitcoin for fiat. And I wouldn't sort of advocate the latter, but certainly if you have to sell Bitcoin for fiat to spend, then I would advocate for that. And I think you're absolutely right. And again, Jeff Booth has sort of been quite influential to me, and he talks about this idea of spending more time in the world that you want to see, in the world that you want to be in. And I've been able over the last year to spend, well, probably the last 6 months, just to spend a little bit less time working and pursue like passion projects. So, for example, I do kickboxing now, and I've been able to have a one-to-one on a Monday morning, which I wouldn't have been able to do a few years ago. But that's something that I'm happy to take the hit on my earnings and to not stack as much Bitcoin. It's allowed me to do this, to hopefully sort of help to educate some other people and orange pill a few more people. And I do think that we shouldn't be lamented for exchanging some of our Bitcoin to live the lives that we want to live, and not everything should be far into the future. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. So,
no, and I think that as well, like on that point, the biggest thing is stepping back and actually asking ourselves, what is it that actually motivates me? And it kind of goes back to that, the 3 C's versus the 3 P's, like the 3 C's being connection, contribution, and challenges over prestige, power, and possessions. Like connections, contributions, challenges. I want to challenge myself. So it's just like, you know what? I would love to, in an absolute ideal world, if Bitcoin goes to where I think it's going to go, I would love to be able to take out a little bit of Bitcoin and go and get my small plane private license so I can go and see what it feels like flying a plane. I would freaking love that. And I feel like that would make a difference in my life. On top of that, I would love to be able to spend less time working and have kids and spend more time with my kids. I would absolutely love that. And so if Bitcoin allows me to pursue that in life, then I'm going to go do that. I'm not going to just continually save endlessly, because what is life if you've just saved money? But I think the key thing is to step back and actually realize what it is that motivates you, what it is that fulfills you, what it is that makes you feel like you can contribute more to your family, your community, whatever it is that motivates you. And that I think is unique to each and every one of us. But I do think that today's society, unfortunately, because our cost of living is rising, we're having less and less capacity, we don't know who we are. And so that's where, as we touched on at the start, the ironic thing about Bitcoin is it gets us to stop thinking about money. It gets us to have more capacity to look inwards and actually understand who we are and how we want to show up. And that, I think, is the most important part.
Yeah, giving yourself that time back to actually stop and actually spend some time in your own head and actually think these things through. And your face lit up then when you started talking about family and flying and things, and it wasn't there wasn't a Lamborghini in sight then. So credit to you. Listen, Seb, this has been fantastic. It's I could talk to you for hours. I don't want to sort of keep you all day. So is there, obviously you've got Looking Glass, is there, what are your plans for that for the future? Like, is there anything you can sort of tell us about that, or where people can sort of go to find that and to and your newsletter? And
For sure. So I would say that I spend my time primarily between 2 aspects. We've got Looking Glass, and with Looking Glass, we have cut back on creating a whole bunch of content, because what we realized is that increasingly there's so many companies out there that are just putting out newsletters, putting out blogs, and it's more fluff just to stay up to date and move up the search rankings. Whereas for us, we want to create what's called evergreen content. You could look back at the content in 5 years' time and the content still holds value. So we're very conscious about the content we produce, making sure that anyone can come to the page and it's not necessarily news-based, it's more idea-based and knowledge-based. And so we don't put out as much content as we used to, just because we want to highlight the content we've already created. And then we've transitioned to spending a little more time, Daz and myself, on the custody piece. So we help out with CODL, which is for pure self-custody. And then we also do the Bitcoin Advisor, and we help out with collaborative custody. So if anyone's ever curious about custody, feel free to reach out. And then on the other side of things, where I spend the other half of my time, is with a company called Block Rewards. And so we're based out of the interior of British Columbia here in Canada. And our whole goal is, how do we get people paid in Bitcoin? And so we're building out like compensation reward tools for people that want to kind of start incorporating Bitcoin in their paycheck, for businesses that are interested in potentially incentivizing employees with Bitcoin. And I'm just like so pumped to be able to see these tools coming to light. And so over the next like 18 months, 2 years, we're going to start to see this grow immensely. And so it's such a cool company to work for, and that's just called Block Rewards. You can find us at blockrewards.ca. But outside of that, I write about these topics. I write about the impact of money on society, relationships, family, you name it, on my blog, The Chi of Self-Sovereignty. And yeah, and you can find me there at just sebbunny.com or Twitter at Seb Bunney, and Bunny's Bunney. But again, Andy, like I hugely appreciate you bringing me on, and I'm excited to kind of listen to more of your podcasts. And yeah, I really enjoyed your questions.
I appreciate your time and your generosity. And both Jeff and Canute have just said, just lean into it, and you'll find people are accommodating, and that's exactly what I found. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate you giving me sort of such a long time to speak to you as well, and pepper you with questions. I'll definitely put all that in the show notes. So I'll put the links to Looking Glass. I'll put the links to Block Rewards as well. The Chi of Self-Sovereignty, which I've been enjoying catching up on as well. So I'll put that in. I'd also just highly recommend The Hidden Cost of Money. So, I mean, Seb doesn't know I'm going to do this, by the way, but what I loved about The Hidden Cost of Money is that it's a Bitcoin book, but kind of in disguise. So the word Bitcoin isn't actually written until page 305. So it's a really good book for, as I say, looking at the symptoms, but then backtracking to linking it back to the problem. So I think it's a great book to orange pill people, to get people started on that sort of journey down the rabbit hole. So I'd wholeheartedly recommend it, and thank you for writing it. I've read it once. I've listened to the audiobook as well, and I'll probably go back numerous times. And there's so much in there that we haven't sort of talked about the IMF and things like that, which I found fascinating. And it's led me to probably go down more and more rabbit holes beyond this. So, but again, thanks for your time. It's been brilliant, and wish you all the best.
And you know what? It's interesting you point that out, that it doesn't mention Bitcoin until kind of almost the very end. And even then, I think it's only a couple pages, because I really do believe that one of the challenges we face when we're trying to help kind of push Bitcoin adoption is that many people, there's so much media talking negatively about Bitcoin. The moment you mention the word Bitcoin, people's walls go up. And so it's just like, how do we overcome that? And I think the way we overcome that is through people actually understanding, one, what the problem is, and two, making sure that that problem resonates with them in their lives. And that's why I think with the Hidden Cost of Money, I really tried to touch on whether it's relationships, whether it's the environment, whether it's our business and politics, so that no matter who you are, there should be a chapter or two that resonate with you, so you can understand broken money through your lens, and only then will you start to understand Bitcoin. But the other thing that I should just quickly mention is that there's actually a hidden Bitcoin logo on the cover somewhere. So see if you can find the hidden Bitcoin logo on the cover, and that's meant to be my hidden orange pill.
I will do that. Just before you go, I'll tell you a little story about a year ago. I build greenhouses. That's what I do. And I was contacted by a company to go and put a building up for a guy called Matt Baker, who he was a British gymnast, and then he's become like a TV presenter. So he was like a presenter of like Blue Peter and The One Show and some sort of fairly sort of big primetime sort of TV shows. And he had this other show where he basically moved back into his childhood farm with his parents, and they run this farm basically. And I was there while they were filming, and I built this greenhouse, and I was sort of mic'd up, and they were sort of asking me questions, and we were sort of pretending to sort of build this thing together and stuff. But for the first couple of hours, I wore a fairly sort of clandestine Bitcoin T-shirt, which was the black T-shirt with the green source code from the first block, and obviously in orange it had Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. So they got about 3 hours of footage, and then the producer came over and says, "Can I just ask you about your T-shirts?" I thought, "Shit, I've been found out here." So he says, "Is that some kind of a political message?" I says, "No, it's not a political message. It's just it's a Bitcoin T-shirt." But and basically, they filmed for the rest of the day. I had to wear a different T-shirt, but they contacted me about a week later saying that they were unable to use any of my footage, and I wouldn't be featured on the TV program. So I wasn't particularly successful at hiding my Bitcoin logo. So, but I'll see if I can find yours. But yeah, yeah.
No way. That's insane. Yeah. I appreciate you showing that. That's nuts that they would. Yeah, maybe if that was to happen now, how long ago was that? When did that happen?
Maybe it would have been 2023. Yeah, I think so. So not that long ago, but maybe if it had been 5 years into the future, it would have been aired. But yeah, but unfortunately, I told everybody I was going to be on TV, and obviously I never quite made it. But there you go. All right, cheers, Sam. Really appreciate it. It's been great, and yeah, we'll put all those in the show notes.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, hopefully, perhaps meet up with you at some point in the future at a conference. I'm going to go to Cheat Code, I think, if he's doing it this year. So yeah, I don't know if you ever go to that one in the UK, but yeah.
I would love to try and make it. One of these days, I will 100% make it there. So we'll see. Maybe it's this year.
All right. Cheers, Seb. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.